I'm chairing this and introducing Feargal, which is a great honor. We were just chatting a little bit before. Feargal first popped up on my horizon as a footnote in the early 1990s, which is giving away my age as well as Feargal's, I suppose. And at that time, I was writing about the possibility, the distant possibility of there ever being a peace agreement in Northern Ireland, and there being a referendum on such a possibility. And at that stage, Feargal had already written several distinguished books that I was inciting in among other things, my doctoral dissertation, also in the 1990s, giving away my age there. Then Feargal and I have actually never met, but we've sort of, I suppose, our paths have crossed, and I have sort of from a distance seen how you, Feargal, was first in Northern Ireland, and then later came here to Britain and latterly to Kent, and of course distinguishedly have written about Northern Ireland and other related matters, of course, and most recently now also the book Breaking Peace, Brexit and Northern Ireland. I think you said that you weren't interested in Europe when you were an undergraduate. I wasn't interested in Europe when I was an undergraduate. And I think a lot of people weren't, because it was sort of a thing that was seen to be all to do with harmonizing bananas and quite technical things. And what is perhaps interesting, and what your book is about, is how this thing called Europe, which is about a lot of technical stuff really, has become an emotional issue, an issue over which people are literally now throwing petrol bombs. We used to have a situation where everybody was happy about the situation, well, happy or unhappy to be happy, or happy to be unhappy about the peace agreement in Northern Ireland, which hasn't been smooth and plain sailing, frankly. It's been, been direct rule on a number of occasions. But I think most of us had considered it to be a thing that was resolved. I remember we had, a few years ago, we had Aaron Leipart, the very distinguished, probably the most distinguished political scientist of the last 50 years, in Coventry. He's technically an associate fellow of our centre. And when he was there, somebody asked him about Northern Ireland. And Professor Leipart said, "I don't think that is particularly interesting. That is a matter that seems to have been solved." Now, of course, a Dutchman living in California may not be the best judge on that, but I think that was very much the case, that Northern Ireland was seen to have been, quote unquote, solved. Then Brexit came along, and there is now a real danger, I think, that we could be breaking the peace, that Brexit in Northern Ireland could lead to that. There is also a possibility, which, of course, I'm particularly interested in with my own research, that we could, in a not so distant future, have a referendum or a border poll on whether the Republic of Ireland should join with Northern Ireland or the other way around, if there should be Irish unification. And I think the prospect of that has probably moved closer as a result of Brexit, but then so has an all and out conflict. So I think without further ado, Feargal, I'm actually really looking forward to listening to what you have to say. And normally you sort of accept these invitations to chair things just because that's kind of your job. But in this particular case, I would literally have paid to listen to you now. So over to you, Feargal.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks for chairing the session, and thanks to Bahar as well for the invitation. And I'm very pleased and delighted to be speaking under the banner of the Centre today, and to have a discussion really about some of these themes that you've flagged up already. Really, what I wanted to do was just talk through some of the themes that Matt's really flagged up there. Initially, when I was writing this book, and it's actually a tale of two books I'll get on to in a second, but when I was writing the book initially, I had a question mark at the end of the Breaking Peace title. And pretty early on in the writing process, I just ditched the question mark. And one of the ironies actually of the whole thing, I suppose, was that initially I had assumed that the Breaking Peace dimension was really about Northern Ireland. But the more I wrote about Brexit, the more it became clear. And I live in Britain, and obviously worked in Britain when I was doing this. And it's actually breaking peace in Great Britain as much as it's breaking peace in Northern Ireland. So I think the breaking peace title spans across not just in Northern Ireland, but also the United Kingdom's internal political relationships, and also its relationships with the European Union. So the title really sort of formed itself in a lot of ways. And the reason I said it's a tale of two books is that obviously the Breaking Peace book is very much about the negotiations, the Brexit negotiations from the referendum, and that book takes us up to probably mid 2019, but certainly before the general election. And the book's really about the almost like not so much a blow by blow account, but really trying to unpack the way in which Northern Ireland was a blind spot in the United Kingdom's decision to leave the EU. And it looks at the debates and looks at the Brexit campaign, and then it looks at the internal relationships amongst the political parties in Northern Ireland, particularly between the DUP and Sinn Féin, and the whole breakdown of devolved government there, and the way in which Breaking Peace make an argument that the peace was already breaking without Brexit, and devolution had enough problems without Brexit. But what Brexit did was it underwrote the existing ethno-national problem. It didn't dilute it or muddy the waters. So as I'm sure many of you know, about 90% of nationalists voted to remain in the EU, and only about 38 or 40% of unionists voted to remain. So it provided another structural rationale for the ethno-national divisions, and it didn't do anything to cross between those and cross over. So the second book there is a revised version of my Northern Ireland Reluctant Peace book with Yale University Press. And this was brought out for the centenary of Northern Ireland, which I'll talk a little about in a second. And this is Northern Ireland, a Fragile Peace. I noticed that my subtitles are all very depressing. I suppose that's because I write about conflict a lot, but peace never seems to be robust or healthy or dynamic, but hopefully the next book I write, I'll have something more positive to talk about. I have a new chapter on Brexit in that book that takes the Breaking Peace story on to the protocol and the aftermath of the protocol, and Boris Johnson's election as leader, and the withdrawal agreement, and so on. And so the Fragile Peace book tries to explain Brexit in a much more historical perspective of Brexit being the latest crisis within, the polity of Northern Ireland that's had a litany of crises, and Brexit being, the latest example of the contested relationships in that place. And what I'm going to talk about now sort of straddles both of these publications. And while we're at it, as you know, the news that we've got this week is that Northern Ireland is 100 years old. We've just passed centenary by 2 days, so we're 2 days into the 2nd century of Northern Ireland, and I suppose it's so far so good at the moment. And a lot of the themes in both of these books really focus on this contested project, because it still is a contested project. Northern Ireland is 100, but it wasn't universally celebrated. Unionists wanted to celebrate, but that was dimmed a bit by more recent events, the protocol being one of those, and Brexit being one of them. And nationalists certainly didn't really want to mark the occasion. And Sinn Féin certainly said there's nothing to celebrate about partition. And people in Great Britain didn't really care one way or the other. And I think that, that you could say that in an offhand way, but I think that ambivalence in Great Britain brings us back to Brexit, because Northern Ireland was not in the mind's eye in 2016 when the Brexit debate was going on. Brexit was essentially about immigration. To me, the Brexit debate was really was a proxy for a discussion about immigration, and also about divisions within the Conservative Party and the Conservative Party's relationships with UKIP. It wasn't really an audit of its membership of the European Union, because if it had have been, we would have had more of a factual discussion about the pros and cons of the European Union. And it wasn't really about that, to me anyway. And of course, it certainly wasn't about Northern Ireland. And I think that project, that 100-year mark, and it is quite a significant achievement for Northern Ireland, sort of landmark anyway. Brexit has really torpedoed it. It certainly torpedoed the DUP, and I'll just come on to that now. So, like, the breaking news from last week is that Arlene Foster has been removed by her own party. Now, she resigned, but she was pushed before she jumped, really, or she jumped before she was pushed. The two things were pretty simultaneous. And that's Arlene Foster's political career, has died on the altar of Brexit, which is ironic given that the DUP were the most avid supporters of the hardest Brexit available. And they've certainly had their fingers burned by that strategy. And Arlene Foster has lost her job as a result of it. That's the latest collateral damage of Brexit in a very real way. And this doesn't just affect the Democratic Unionist Party, it affects everybody because the DUP is the largest political party in Northern Ireland at the moment, albeit only just. Who succeeds Arlene Foster as leader of the Democratic Unionist Party will have to decide, first of all, whether they will take up the First Minister role. Maybe, Matt, you have a view on this, I'm not sure, but they could conceivably, now there's an election between Edwin Poots and Jeffrey Donaldson, there may be a discussion over whether the protocol will be, an issue there about before they take up the First Minister role. Now, they don't take that role up, then after 7 days, the Secretary of State has to call a general election in Northern Ireland, or an assembly election rather. So we could have an early assembly election. Elections in Northern Ireland generally don't bring people together, they drive them apart. And the future of the Democratic Unionist Party, if that goes in a more conservative direction, then the whole notion of devolution with Sinn Féin as the largest nationalist party, you have to question the rationality of that or the viability of that if the Democratic Unionist Party doesn't really want to play ball in that direction. So Foster's resignation / expulsion from the leadership role was a direct consequence of Brexit. It was a consequence of the DUP's policies over Brexit. And that in turn, I think, is causing and is going to cause political instability in Northern Ireland over the next several months. And I'll talk a bit about some of these things in a second, and we can discuss it in the conversation as well. But one of the things I think Brexit did, and this comes through very much in the Breaking Peace book, in some of the chapters there, is that it squeezed the space between nationalists in Northern Ireland who were claiming that Northern Ireland was unique. It needed a unique solution. It was different to the rest of the United Kingdom. It has a different nationality claim that's equally legitimate to the unionist Britishness claim. And unionists who claimed that actually Northern Ireland was part of the UK, it was part of the one country. Now, whenever Brexit happened, and certainly when Theresa May became Prime Minister, the framing, I'll come on to the framing in a second, but it was very much the people of Britain have spoken, and the people of Britain have decided to leave the European Union. And that was problematic for Northern Ireland because, of course, Northern Ireland spoke in a different direction. The majority vote in Northern Ireland by quite a margin, 56% to 44%, was actually not to leave the European Union, to stay in it. It raised issues about whose country you were actually in. So to collapse the United Kingdom and its devolved regions into a unitary Britain has spoken, airbrushed out alternative voices. And that started it. So immediately 2016 happened. The DUP wanted to leave with the rest of their country. Sinn Féin wanted a border poll and Irish reunification and said that the moral legitimacy of London to govern Northern Ireland had ended. And so it forced these sides into opposite, even more opposite corners than they were. And it raised the thorny question of who has a right to self-determination, under what grounds, and how do we operationalise that? And of course, Brexit was not a devolved matter, quite rightly. Under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, it wasn't devolved. But it did seem to sit at odds with the whole consent principle that underpinned the peace process and underpinned the Good Friday Agreement, that Northern Ireland's status would not change unless a majority consented to a change of its status. Now, that wasn't initially conceived as being anything to do with European membership, but something as large as being removed from the European Union with the safeguards that the European Union provided a different equation for nationalists. And people said this to me when I was writing the book, which said, look, you know, nationalists who didn't really have a unification project were suddenly, the equation suddenly changed. And while they might accept the status quo of being in the United Kingdom under the canopy of the European Union, they were faced with a slightly different equation after Brexit, which was to be located within this more English version of the United Kingdom under a conservative right-wing administration outside the benefits and protections that the European Union offered. So it radicalized nationalist opinion and made them probably more persuadable to, I suppose, a more independent-minded project. So it sort of produced a binary in or out when the peace process had all been about ambiguity and, you know, in betweenness. And the Good Friday Agreement, you know, it wasn't based on certainties, it was based on ambiguity and what's called constructive ambiguity, where we could get on with the journey while agreeing to differ on the destination. Now, you could see that as some sort of, you know, paradox or a problematic idea that if you don't know where you're going, how can you actually proceed? But peace processes are all about ambiguity, and if you're looking for certainty in a peace process, you're going to be sadly disappointed because at best they provide a framework for moving forwards, and so the consent principle underpinned that ambiguity. It was basically status quo until the consent of a majority in Northern Ireland wants something else, and we'll come on to that maybe in the discussion about whether a border poll will be triggered when a majority wants something else, or whether we're now in the realms of something else other than just a majority. It parked this final destination of Northern Ireland, whether it was going to be stay in the United Kingdom or have some sort of United Ireland or changed constitutional status. Obviously, the Good Friday Agreement also reduced the risk of spoilers on both sides by having an inclusive participation on all sides, apart from the DUP at the time. It left some issues out, such as the future of the police and decommissioning criteria. There was a formula for decommissioning, but it was very vague. And crucially, and this is where Matt might have some views, it was voted for, and when referendums were good, you know, if you were a Remainer, or if you were a yes person in Northern Ireland in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, it got 71% of support in Northern Ireland. So there was like a triple lock. You had the parties making an agreement, you had the governments passing it in their parliaments, and you had the people voting for it. And a lot of people forget that there wasn't just one referendum in Northern Ireland, there were two, or in Ireland there were two. There was one in Northern Ireland that passed by 71%, and there was one in the Irish Republic that passed by 95%, and that changed the constitution of the Irish Republic and Articles 2 and 3 into a much more aspirational form, which unionists were quite pleased about. So good versus bad referendums. Well, the Good Friday Agreement referendum was noticeably different to Brexit. Brexit was a jump into the unknown. It was yes or no on membership of the EU, really with nothing on the page after that. While in 1998, there was a manifesto, you know, there was a document. Now, there was still ambiguity within that document, but we knew the basic infrastructure: power sharing, internal 108-seat assembly, north-south bodies that would evolve, various other east-west bodies, prisoners getting out in 2 years, etc. There were words on pages. We could contest what those actually meant in the longer term, but there was certainly plenty to chew on before the referendum was held. It was endorsed by politicians, apart from the DUP, both unionist and nationalist, and radical sections, including the Progressive Unionist Party and UDP, as well as Sinn Féin. So there was a lot of buy-in to the referendum from across the ethno-national divide. And there was also, and this again differs from Brexit, a strong civil society buy-in. It wasn't just a party political campaign. There was a very big independent yes campaign that was quite important in terms of selling this agreement to people. So the State of the Union then, I think, is now, brings us back to the chronology of Northern Ireland's history, which is that I think 2016, is on the scoreboard along with all these other dates. So in 1921, when Northern Ireland was partitioned, we've just had or Northern Ireland was created, sorry, we've just had the centenary. 1968, when the civil rights movement really got moving and politics moved onto the streets. 1972, when the Stormont devolved project ended and British government became politically involved again. 1985, when the Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed and the Irish government was given a formal role in the affairs of Northern Ireland and really internationalised the diplomatic process and brought the American government more centrally involved, I think, in the Northern Ireland context. 1998, when you had the Good Friday Agreement, or Belfast Agreement, if you prefer, and 2016 with Brexit, and now we've had the centenary. So I think 2016 definitely holds its own amongst those, in that calendar for me. Now we're 2 days into the second century, and I think that comes back to a point Matt made at the start. I think now that Brexit does question how far Northern Ireland is going to get into that second century. Now, I think a border poll is now much more central to if you just look at the newspaper debate. Commentators are talking about whether there should or should not be a border poll. They weren't really talking about that several years ago because it didn't seem relevant. It's certainly, I think, on the front burner of political debate now. Not only whether there be a border poll, but actually what that would be about. What does Irish reunification actually mean? What would a question on a border poll be? And what would the modalities be of actually doing all this? And we're very much at the beginning of that conversation, probably. Just wanted to say a couple of things about the language of Brexit, and I bring this up in the Breaking Peace book when I look quite closely at the British government's negotiating position. And there was two aspects to this, and one is the framing of Brexit, and the other is the aspirational language linked to it. And here we've got, this was Theresa May's Lancaster House speech in January 2017, which really set out the red lines of the UK government and its negotiating stance, and signalled the type of Brexit that it wanted. And said a little over 6 months ago, the British people voted for change. They voted to shape a brighter future for our country. They voted to leave the European Union and embrace the world. Now, some of those things might be true. Some of them may not be. Just to take the British people, well, the British people didn't vote for change. Some of the British people voted for change, and some of the British people voted for no change. And some of the people who voted weren't British at all. They were Irish. So Scotland and Northern Ireland, so two of the devolved regions voted for no change, but they were airbrushed out of the post-Brexit narrative, partly because Theresa May needed a coherent, way forward. They voted to shape a brighter future for our country. Well, whose country are we talking about? And again, this, people in a political nanosecond in Northern Ireland were picking at the scabs of, if you pardon my horrible metaphor, of the language. And did they vote to embrace the world? Well, a lot of people I met from 2016 didn't look like they were really embracing the world, to be honest with you. And nobody really knows why and what people voted for, other than the actual binary choice that they made, or even whether it's anything to do with the EU. So that's the framing. The other one was the aspirations that were part of the whole UK narrative once Northern Ireland became an issue. And that linked into the common travel area in particular, and the prospect of a hard border on the island of Ireland, and the Irish government's own lobbying over what was going to happen. And this was from the same speech. We will work to deliver a practical solution that allows the maintenance of the common travel area with the Republic while protecting the integrity of the United Kingdom's immigration system. And the second one, nobody wants to return to the borders of the past, so we'll make it a priority to deliver a practical solution as soon as we can. So again, people in Northern Ireland from all political persuasions had decoded this in like a bolt of lightning, because the first one's contingent on something else, And, we may all work for our ref entries, and we may all work to get grants, and we may all work to do all sorts of things as academics. Doesn't necessarily mean we do that. So what does we will work to actually mean in terms of guarantees? Well, it doesn't mean anything other than a commitment. It doesn't guarantee anything. And nobody wants to return to the borders of the past. Of course they don't, but that doesn't mean they're not going to get them. And what does as soon as we can mean? It could be tomorrow, or it could be, a decade. So the problem with the aspirational language was it increasingly frustrated the Remain side and the Irish government and the European Union over what was going to happen. And of course, the reason for that was because the British government didn't want to put all their cards on the table and wanted to negotiate what they could out of the process. But it certainly resulted in a loss of trust, I suppose. So just coming back to Brexit then, and Brexit Britain. Brexit was never this. It was never, the United Kingdom and the European Union. Brexit was always this. Brexit was an English project. It wasn't a United Kingdom project. And that became problematic for the whole sort of movement of Brexit in the context of Northern Ireland politics. For a lot of unionists as well as nationalists as well, I think it's worth saying. So what we had was a 2 or 3 year slide really, where the negotiations really stumbled. The DUP, and this is one of the ironies of the whole story really, in that the DUP, Brexit was not a union issue for the Democratic Unionist Party. It wasn't even, it wasn't a core issue for them. They allowed a free vote on Brexit in 2016. It's quite unusual for the DUP to do. And there were Remainers in the DUP. So they were relatively agnostic initially, but gradually hardened up as the Brexit campaign got underway. And once Brexit happened, then the key thing for the Democratic Unionist Party was to make sure that Northern Ireland was treated the same as every other part of the United Kingdom, and that they didn't, as far as they were concerned, that they weren't given sort of second-class treatment within the union. And of course, the DUP were very well placed to make sure that didn't happen, because they held the balance of power after the 2017 general election. And again, that's another really crucial point. When Theresa May called an election she didn't have to call because she felt that the opinion polls were in her favour, she lost her majority. Slim majority though it was, but she lost it, and the DUP became crucial to Theresa May staying in government, which again, a bit like John Major back in the 1990s, it really made the UK government look beholden to the DUP in terms of what it did in Northern Ireland. So there was a good faith problem then when the British government made comments about Northern Ireland or positions on Brexit to do with Northern Ireland, when it looked like it was being run by the opinions within the Democratic Unionist Party at the time. So certainly the DUP had a lot of leverage from 2017 to 2019, and they played a very strong hand very badly. I think it's probably fair to say. Of course, political scientists have got retrospect that politicians don't enjoy. But nonetheless, I mean, these are pictures here of Boris Johnson being the guest of honor at the DUP annual party conference in 2019, where he said that no government could or should ever put a border in the Irish Sea. They've got to bin the backstop. He was cheered to the echo by the DUP and by Arlene Foster, who said he was a real friend of the union, and they backed his leadership campaign. And he visited a bus factory in Ballymena. That's where they make those buses. And that's just just before he drove that bus metaphorically over Arlene Foster's political leadership. So it suited Boris Johnson to do a deal with the Irish government to get a Brexit deal. He did that deal, and that deal was to introduce different arrangements for Northern Ireland than apply to Great Britain, and that's seen in the Northern Ireland Protocol. And of course, that was massively difficult for the unionists to stomach. And so, yes, Boris Johnson got Brexit done in the end, but the only way he got it done was to effectively move to the position where the European single market would be protected. There would be a border somewhere, and instead of the border being obviously there was a no deal would have been a border on the island of Ireland, which would have resulted in no deal with the European Union. In the context of this is Joe Biden had just won the American presidency and was very clear that the Good Friday Agreement was sacrosanct in his eyes. So had the UK crashed out without a deal, it's very unlikely they would have got anywhere with the American administration either. So I'm sure that had something to do with the way in which the UK's Brexit policy has evolved since. I just wanted to say a couple of last words if I've got time. I just wanted to say a little bit about the wider context here, because one of the aspects of the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement and Brexit that probably doesn't get a lot of coverage. The international media descends whenever the streets are burning in Belfast, but they're not so interested in the background sort of structural dynamics of the thing. Anglo-Irish relations have been badly damaged, not irreparably damaged, but certainly badly damaged by the experience of Brexit. Now, before 2016, certainly at sort of the elite level, Anglo-Irish relations had become a lot warmer with state visits in both directions. We had the former commander of the IRA shaking the hand of the chief of staff of the British Armed Forces, and the Queen and the head of state, and reciprocal visits, joint press releases. Effectively, Northern Ireland had become a joint policy between. Wasn't that it was joint authority, but it was certainly arguments would have been held indoors rather than outdoors. And what Brexit did was, and this was partly due to European membership back to 1973. And from that point, Ireland and the United Kingdom had something in common, which was their membership of the European Union. They also had personal relationships between civil servants and politicians, and they were able to meet each other very frequently to discuss Northern Ireland under the canopy of European Union membership and summit meetings and so on. But what Brexit did was it put Ireland and Britain on opposite sides of the negotiating table when previously they'd been on the same side. And that's been noticeable up to now. But the way I've sort of envisaged it has been that the United Kingdom and the Irish government are the two big super tankers, if you like, sailing in parallel with one another, and Northern Ireland's a little tugboat in the middle between them, and it's got guide ropes it's got ropes to each super tanker. And Brexit has meant that these super tankers are ever so slightly changing direction, and those ropes are starting to tighten, and that's going to be very bad news for the tugboat. And just to strangle my metaphor, Northern Ireland's a tugboat. Eventually those ropes are going to ping off and people are going to get hurt. And the Anglo-Irish relationship was really the foundation stone for the peace process. It wasn't maybe the most noticeable aspect of it, but I think without a coherent joint approach from London and Dublin, it would have been very difficult for the Good Friday Agreement to have been signed in the first place, or for negotiations to have prospered. Now, if you go and you look at a lovely house, it's very unlikely you're going to go, look at the foundations in that house. Aren't they beautiful? Really impressive foundations there. You're probably not going to do that unless you're an architect. You're going to be looking, oh, look at the lovely balcony and look at the lovely stonework and so on. But without the foundations, the house is going to fall over. And the worry in Northern Ireland is that unless Anglo-Irish relations get put back together again in some amicable way, Northern Ireland's instability is it's going to damage the capacity of Northern Ireland's devolved settlement to go forward smoothly, or more smoothly, should I say. So now we're 100 years old. We've all got the vuvuzelas out if we indeed want to celebrate, and we've ended up with the resignation of Arlene Foster, the possibility of devolved government becoming more fragile. We've either got an assembly election pretty quickly if the DUP don't want to step up to be First Minister, or even if they do, we'll have an assembly election in 2022. and you can be pretty sure that one of the first issues in the debate will be the Northern Ireland Protocol and its continuation. And it's Northern Ireland that has to take the vote in 2024 on whether Northern Ireland will remain, in its current alignment with the European Union, or whether it won't. So that issue is really going to go from now until 2024 at the earliest. And this is going to be like a drip feed of instability to me between now and 2024. And goodness knows what other crises we're going to have between then and 2024. So what we've seen is a strengthening of calls for a border poll and Irish reunification, because the EU has already said that a reunified Ireland would automatically be part of the EU, and it hasn't said that about Scotland. So that is, that's a bonus for those who are pushing a reunification ticket. I see no reason why this discussion about should or should not a border poll happen will go away anytime soon. I think it's only going to accelerate and increase, and you can certainly see that starting in the Irish Republic in terms of the political discussions that are going on at government level there as well. And so, I think it's a reason. If I would certainly put a pound on there being a referendum on Scottish independence in the next decade, and on a referendum in Northern Ireland in the next decade. I wouldn't put any money on what the outcome of those would be, but I certainly think we're going to have them, and I think those will be destabilising. Which isn't to say they shouldn't happen. I just think that there will be a lot of discussion about the legitimacy and about the modalities and procedures and outcomes of those votes, and whether or not they should be majority votes or weighted majorities or something else. So I've probably talked for long enough. So I just want to stop and say thank you for listening and taking part, and to thank the Centre again for having me. And if you want to read more about the Breaking Peace book, there's a link to it there. And again, the Fragile Peace book from Yale, there's a link to it there as well if you want to read that. So I will stop now and maybe have a discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Feargal. That was incredibly interesting, and I took notes as if I was a young student again, really. I have personally a couple of questions, and I can now see Lee has joined us, my PhD student who is now smiling, who works for one of the organizations that have been mentioned here. It was interesting when I read the title of the book, and I got sort of a slightly sort of feeling of all sort of a theological feeling, like breaking peace sound like breaking bread, and I was sort of thinking sort of in biblical terms almost, which is often there. And then as I was having that association, I thought that it would be appropriate to quote my namesake Matthew from the Bible, who says, "They that take up the sword should perish by the sword," which is, I think, the Ulster Unionist would probably recognize the reference there to that, and I think there is a lot of the theology about it. I suppose you asked me a couple of questions also, Feargal, when during your talk, which I will then respond to. I don't know if it was a rhetorical question or not. And I think what is interesting, just my views on what would happen now if there were to be an election and so on. And from memory, and Lee, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Sinn Féin would be about 7% larger than the DUP on the most recent opinion polls, which were taken about a month ago from memory. And I suppose the Unionist bloc altogether would have 41% of the votes. That's with DUP, the Ulster Unionist Party, and TUV. But what is interesting, I think, and I'd sort of like your comment on this, but lead on to the St. Andrew Agreement. They slightly changed the rules for who should become First Minister, and I think it's now the largest, the largest designation, I think is the word that's being used. So basically, the largest party in the Stormont Assembly proposes a candidate, and on current form that would be Sinn Féin, which would be a lot of fun. And I suppose my question to you would be whether that is correct. And then lastly, just a clarifying thing about the a so-called supermajority in a border poll, if there were to be a border poll. In sort of in pure legal terms, if you actually look at the Good Friday Agreement, then it says there quite explicitly that that 50% plus one person, right, just the barest majority is sufficient. So that literally can't be a supermajority. I mean, supermajorities are relatively rare in these cases. And also, a lot of countries have become independent on or made changes on a very slim majority. I mean, Brexit was about a percentage difference. So if there were to be a referendum, which should take place when there is a consistent, that seems to be a consistent majority in favour, is the wording, and the Secretary of State has to call it. I think that there's a little bit of elasticity in the wording there, because I don't think actually anybody at the time, also from memory when I was involved in it, I don't think anybody expected there would be a referendum this soon. Everybody expected this would be the best of all possible worlds. If you wanted to live in Northern Ireland and call yourself Irish, you could have an Irish passport and pretend to be Irish, and you were actually Irish, and you literally had the best of both worlds. So before I let other people, before I monopolize too much, and I suppose my question would be, if there were to be an election and Sinn Féin were to be the largest party, would the First Minister then be a Shinner rather than an Ulster man or woman?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. All very good points there. Simple answer is yes. If Sinn Féin and they were very close to overtaking them in previous elections in terms of both vote share and seats. The issue, I suppose, would be, would the DUP, assuming they're the largest unionist party, want devolution if they were deputy first minister instead of first minister? So I think it's entirely conceivable that they would just not want to go into that type of devolved situation. Now, if we rewind slightly, Sinn Féin under Martin McGuinness did offer the DUP a joint first minister type of model to take the heat out of the fact that these are essentially joint roles. They're not deputy to the first minister. It's a joint, as you know, it's a joint role. But of course, it's very important for the unionists to have that symbolic primacy. But under the current scheme of things, the smart money would probably be on Sinn Féin emerging as the largest party, unless there's a bounce effect for a new DUP leader, of course, which there might be, depending on who that is, or whether there's a leader and a first minister who are separate. There's maybe some potential for the DUP to come off the rails and do better, but it's difficult for the DUP to get away from the argument that they are responsible for the protocol, and that in any election is going to haunt them. So my money would be on Sinn Féin probably being the largest party and them being first minister, and then you're into the viability of the actual devolved, the desire of unionism to go into devolution on that basis. Well, that's a matter for them. On the second point, the supermajority point, absolutely right. These were checks that people thought would never be cashed. And I think that's part of the issue. That, and I'm talking about the Irish government as much as I am the British government. The operationalization of a border poll is vague, partly because I think nobody really thought it would be triggered in their, political lifetimes. So it was left vague, or maybe it was the easiest option not to spell it out. But I would expect the second approach, if there were benchmarks that looked like there was a majority for change, I would expect the second string approach for the British government to be, well, it's not clear necessarily that SDLP voters absolutely want reunification. There's still some doubt in the system, and so we're not triggering it yet. There may even be a public order dimension to this, where they say, well, it's going to be destabilising. But it's very interesting to me. It's actually I'm actually more interested at the moment in the Irish government, not just the government, but general conversation in the Irish Republic, which has really now started to push the idea of weighted majorities, 2/3 majorities, supermajorities, as you say. But previously they'd been all about the letter of the Good Friday Agreement. And as you point out, there's nothing in the letter of the Good Friday Agreement about majorities, apart from a simple 50% plus one. And I think that's because they thought it wasn't going to happen.
That's very, very helpful. I was wondering now, I can see we have Lee now, and Lee is my PhD student who also works in the Republic of Ireland, is Irish, of course. And you're probably sitting about 10 yards away from the leadership of the largest party in the Dáil. So I don't know, what's your perspective on what Feargal just said? Because I think the last poll only gives 51% in Ireland for unification, which strikes me as being rather low. Your party might be different, but
my name's Lee. I'm one of Matt's PhDs, and I also do work for a Sinn Féin TD. Obviously, anything I say here is for my own views and not those of Sinn Féin. And I think we might be the second largest party. I don't think we're quite there in terms of TDs, and Fianna Fáil is more than us. Just a few real quick things. I think maybe I'll focus solely on the perspective within 26 counties, or the Republic of Ireland, as we might term it. There's a few developments. One of the most significant one, and this was occurring before Brexit anyway, which is the Irish government's withdrawal from, I think, in my view, any serious political engagement with what's going on in the north. And one of the major reasons behind this was the electoral rise of Sinn Féin and the need to present the 6 counties and what occurs there as sort of Sinn Féin's responsibility, because of the fact that they participate within the power-sharing institutions. Traditionally, and being involved there, particularly for Fianna Fáil, was electorally advantageous for the Irish government. And shaking hands with Martin McGuinness or Gerry Adams, was kind of a good photo op. But now, of course, Gerry Adams in particular moved down south in 2011 to become a TD here in Dáil Éireann. That's changed the calculus significantly, and therefore, in a lot of cases now, Sinn Féin are direct electoral competition, and actually they've surpassed Fianna Fáil in terms of pure votes, not in terms of TDs here. A development that probably when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, or maybe the St Andrews Agreement was signed, wasn't really foreseeable. So I think Feargal's right to focus on that. I think it's an incredibly important sort of thing, and we have basically to look at the sort of the discourse in a lot of different entities, and also the legalities within a lot of different entities. A United Ireland referendum would probably require an act of the British Parliament, an act of the Irish Parliament, and perhaps more than likely some form of enactment within the devolved assembly, or something being passed by the Northern Secretary, depending on if these institutions are up. So I think legally that would be quite interesting. Just a final point on the politics as well, actually, within unionism that Matt mentioned. I think we're looking at probably some form of unionist electoral unity, and the DUP themselves might be shrinking in terms of their vote, but it's now, as of now, for instance, they're on 18%, the TUV are on 10%. I think in the previous election it was something like 26% for the DUP, and much lower figure with 3 or 4% for the TUV. So there will be pressure. There's already pressure from senior members of the Orange Order to have some form of unionist electoral unity, such that I think the Sinn Féin being the sort of the first minister, or the nominal first head of government, as it's also referred to, I don't think that's so much of the issue as sort of trying to consolidate unionism and unionist electoral gains. Certainly the inbuilt majority is gone. There's no doubt about that. And the rise of the Alliance Party and the Green Party, who are designate themselves as other, not nationalists or unionists, within the Assembly, is highly significant as well. So just a quick chug, stop through a few different items, and Feargal, very much looking forward to reading the book, and I'll probably leave things there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lee. That's good to get the perspective from south of the border. I thought it was interesting what you said before, Feargal, about the unionists always talking about being part of Great Britain, really. And of course, when I looked at my passport this morning, because now I can start traveling again, it struck me that it says the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and I think the latter is increasingly of significance, that it is, even in constitutional terms, and way back to 1921, has always been that sort of add-on. And I think that sort of element of not quite being part of the family, being sort of the slightly naughty stepchildren, or the last born, or whatever the metaphor is, has always been has sort of added, fuel to the fire, really. But I don't know if you have any comments on what Lee said. Otherwise, we should leave it open to other people who may have questions.
No, I think I'll leave it for, and if there's other people want to get in, I'll let them get in, and then maybe if not, I'll say a few other things.
Quintin, I can see you're there. I mean, so do you have any questions?
I like the breaking bread analogy, but I think the next edition, Feargal, should be Breaking Bad. I'm taking advantage of the common travel area, which is actually one of the underpinning sets of relationships between the two islands going back to the 20s that has been interesting during COVID because of the reluctance of either government to put in travel barriers between the two. And then there was a bit of compliance tourism. If foreign travellers realised if they flew through Dublin, they could then exercise their rights under the common travel area to get into Britain without quarantining. So there's some interesting anomalies there. But my question is about Scotland, because I'm now in Scotland and the elections tomorrow are obviously really interesting. What happens if there is an SNP majority with or without the Greens, with or without Alba and Salmon's spoiler efforts, and there is a referendum? I agree it's not going to be quick, but say 3, 4, 5 years, possibly after a further election or whatever the political formulation between Westminster and Scotland is, and Scotland does decide to leave. What do you think the implications are for unionism? Because Scotland, after all, is the mothership even more than London and Westminster. It's the Church of Scotland. It's the source of so much of the plantation. So what implications of dominoes falling do you think there will be for Ireland?
Just before you answer, Feargal, I think everybody here will not be aware how distinguished the questioner was. Quintin, of course, was the man who ran the Good Friday Agreement referendum in Northern Ireland, and so we're grateful that you're joining us, Quintin. You're too modest to introduce yourself here, so I will have to do it for you.
Thanks, Matt, and good to see you, Quintin. And just for everybody else's benefit, the genesis of the Breaking Peace book started at a seminar that Quintin ran for myself and other colleagues at Kent on devolution in Northern Ireland, and we had Brexit. We had, it was on the 24th of June 2016, so the day after the referendum, the day of the results, when we all came blinking into Belfast's grey dawn, and David Cameron whistled his way back into Downing Street. So that's when I really realised that something massive hit us. And the question about Scotland's absolutely, right, spot on. It pulls the union rug from unionism to my way of thinking, not at an existential level I'm talking about, not necessarily. I think there's going to be a distinction between that sort of existential unionism and identity. That's going to be more problematic for them in the context of an English Conservative government, and it's going to be a relationship more with England than it will be with Scotland. Then you're also going to get Scotland then having, or presumably trying to get back into the European Union. So there'll be, if there was a Scottish referendum that was, leave the United Kingdom, I would, well, I don't know, Quentin, if you think this, but certainly the last time, one of the main planks of the argument was European independence within the EU. And that's going to push Scotland into a dialogue with the European Union in a way that unionists and the DUP, that sort of Brexiteer unionist in Northern Ireland is going to be even more isolated and even more connected to a Brexiteer argument in England. The difference, I think, between the two is that it's going to be easier, I think, for Scotland internally to argue the case for change if it has a positive outcome on an independence vote than it will be for Northern Ireland, where you've got, I think, more of a contestation over nationality claims than you've got in Scotland. So, I think that's going to not be the same there. But it takes away a significant plank of unionism if the union as it's envisaged as, not just an English allegiance, but a British allegiance, it's going to be difficult over the longer term for unionists to make the case. And I think that unionism is going to get into a space pretty soon where it has to make the case for the union against the other case, which is for a change in its constitutional status towards unification. And that case is increasingly more difficult. And I think independence in Scotland is going to make the unionist case even more difficult for them to make in comparison with that debate 100 years ago, in the context where you've got a more modern, secular Irish Republic. I think the case for the union, and Peter Robinson's been making this argument, the unionists have got to get their skates on and have got to make a coherent case for the undecideds to buy in. I think if Scotland goes independent, I think that's going to make those persuadables, some of them, more likely to consider doing something similar to what Scotland have done, particularly Remainer unionists in Northern Ireland. Back, if we talk the language of Brexit in 2016, that process that happens in Scotland, particularly if it's a positive experience for Scotland, may well then filter through into the persuadables, if you talk about that 15-20% group in the middle, in terms of what way they might jump in a border poll if and when it happens in Northern Ireland. That'll be my reading on it.
Thank you for the question, Quintin, and thank you for answering that, Feargal. I wonder if there are any other questions, or maybe I can just suggest one about, in this day and age of symbolic politics. There was a poll not long ago that John Curtis, of all people, shared with me, which showed that 30% of all SNP voters do not want independence, which is a rather large number. And I was wondering if the same would be true, and I suppose you can trip in here as well, Quintin, but mainly you, Feargal, if the same would be true in reverse. I think you said the SDLP voters may not really want unification because they rather like things as they are. And if there is sort of and also in reverse, if there indeed there are unionists or Protestants or whatever designation we give them, who might say, well, look, Ireland is not a quote unquote pathetic monocultural state, as I think somebody once called them, David Trimble. Ireland has now become, a progressive, liberal, forward-looking kind of place. And if there might be crossovers, so there might be SDLP voters who would say, well, we're pretty happy to be where we are, because at least we have the NHS and so on. Whereas there might be unionist voters who would say, well, Ireland might not be so bad after all. So I'm just sort of wondering if there might be crossovers.
Well, just if I come in that first, I certainly don't think it's a binary, either or. I think there's a spectrum of viewpoints, and I think that those are quite dynamic, and I think it will depend probably on how that debate is framed over what and this comes back to the Brexit decision. Nobody knew what they were voting for, really. It was a blank piece of paper. I think everybody really, if there's a border poll, wants a bit more flesh on the bone over what exactly they're going to be voting for, and I think that's where you're going to see that spectrum take a bit more shape. I think that, yes, there'd be a large section of Irish nationalists, up to the Brexit vote certainly, that were quite content, didn't really have a unification agenda. But as I said, I think Brexit has moved some of them across into thinking, well, there's no real future in a right-wing conservative English relationship outside the European Union, and it's forced some of them across into probably the arms of a unification vote. It also, I think, depends a little bit on how Brexit plays out over the next few years. If the protocol, becomes a real issue, if you can't, take your dog on holiday without all sorts of stuff from the vet, if life just becomes much more of a pain in terms of moving around and checks and the rest of it, then the whole sort of I think equation starts to shift slightly. And some of this, I think, also links into issues to do with what's the offer from Irish nationalism to unionism. What's the buy-in? Is it a take it or leave it United Ireland because we've got 50% plus one of the vote? Or is it something a bit more attractive that might involve federalism or, cabinet seats in the Irish government, or, changes to, and this is something that the Republic of Ireland, in my opinion, is still at, at square one with. How is the Republic of Ireland going to change its cultural dimensions to accommodate 1 million Protestants from Northern Ireland? I don't think it's really got anywhere in thinking about that, not anywhere outside a debating chamber. When are the main political parties going to start using those in elections in the Irish Republic to say we would advocate, for instance, a new flag, a new anthem? I know those are symbolic dimensions, but symbolism is important. But also then political power, resources. How are these things going to change or not? And I think that's where this spectrum of opinion is going to be more clearly defined, in my view.
I can see that Stephen had a question. I think in Ireland, they recently changed the health system to become, if you like, more like the NHS. I don't know if that has any, but Stephen, do you want to formulate that question to the rest of us?
I'd be interested in people with more insight into the South than me about whether an all-Ireland NHS is a potential goer for the future.
Thanks very much, Stephen, for that. And I think this brings us back to this issue about, once you dig into what people want in their governance structures, it's amazing what pops out. And it doesn't surprise me at all that sort of, I think there's a lot of Irish nationalists who are as keen on the NHS model as unionists. And I think you're right about that in terms of adhering to that as a real asset of being in the United Kingdom. But I think that connected my brain to the fact that I don't really, I think there's a lot of rhetoric around constitutional change as labels. And I think once we start investigating and sort of analysing what these labels mean and drawing them out, they will evolve into something else. And I would be amazed if there was a border poll on the concept of a United Ireland back in the 1937 De Valera mode. I think it's going to be much more likely to be a vote that actually asks some very difficult questions for Irish nationalists over the price that they're willing to pay for unity, both politically, culturally, economically. And that would be, again, a huge irony if the conversation that has to be had for constitutional change actually morphs the traditional model of Irish republicanism in a way that actually wasn't what they thought. It's not something 1916 in aspic. It's something actually for the 21st century that might not be quite what they thought they were getting back then. And so yes, an all Ireland NHS type model might be one component, but there may be other components of it. And this brings me back to the point about how do you encourage and incentivize unionists to buy in to constitutional change, and a take it or leave it option. Yes, if you have the numbers, you could make that argument, but your vote in a border poll is going to be much lower if you take that approach. If you take an approach where you have a long think about how you want your society structured, which may include a national health service, well, what's that do to taxation? What's that do to other components of your political and economic environment? And that, I think, is going to be part of the debate. But I don't think there's any simple answers to it. But I think it's up for grabs.
Excellent, thank you. I think Quentin has a question.
Thanks. I was just going to add to that discussion because I think we're in a reverse ferret situation here. I think it is more difficult for Scotland to win independence because of Brexit. Because for full disclosure, I worked on the No Campaign, the Better Together side in that referendum. We argued the case about a border with England and were laughed off the debate. That wasn't going to happen. There wouldn't need to be a border. But now we know about borders and we know about hard borders. And Scotland has a border in the sea with Ireland. And the border with England will be writ large in that debate in a very negative way. Secondly, the currency debate is much, much tougher now because it was a theoretical debate in 2014, but now the European rejoining and having to take the euro, which is not a terribly strong currency, that debate will be pretty negative. And the economic debate, At that time, oil was $110 a barrel, and now it's less than half that. And the debt question, plus the Brexit lessons of how difficult it is to extract yourself from a larger union of many centuries standing. And in the European case, it was only 50 years. But in the Scotland, Britain case, it's a lot more. So I think it will actually be harder, and we may actually have reached peak nationalism. But turning to Ireland, I think it'll be easier because the question is about integrating Northern Ireland into the Republic, which is, as Mad says, a free, independent, secular, human rights supporting, culturally liberal, referendum on equal marriage, abortion on demand, more or less, and so forth. And that is critical for that middle ground, less so for nationalism and unionism will be against it, but that middle ground, which has at last emerged statistically and almost in electoral terms, of those who are not much bothered about diehard unionism or diehard nationalism, republicanism, who accepted the Good Friday Agreement as a eeksy peeksy, bit of this, bit of that. You can be Irish, you can be British, you can be both. We'll have North-South institutions, we'll have East-West. And now the push factors away from the Republic are removed, and the pull factors are massively stronger in terms of access to Europe, access to Erasmus, access to European market. And already some businesses are doing really well by having pivoted away from Britain because of those dog passport controls you mentioned, Feargal. And they check the mud on the tire of your tractor to make sure you're not importing disease. So there are some businesses which are now pivoting to source from the European market through Dublin, and that process of adjustment will be really interesting. So I think the debate in Ireland will be fascinating if the parties rise, and this is a job for academia as well, to help shape that debate and move it away from an emotional orange or green and the passport and the flag and the anthem to the economic, social, cultural questions that we've been beginning to discuss in this webinar.
But I agree with all of that, Quentin. And I think, again, this brings us back to Brexit in the sense that the next Scottish referendum is going to be massively changed by the Brexit process in a way that the 2014 one wasn't, particularly over both, the economic side and the border issue. And it'll be very interesting to see how that gets, I suppose, rationalised by the SNP when they come to make that case.
Right. Well, I suppose it falls to me then to wrap this up. Before I was going on this call, I was updating my book on Angela Merkel. It's got nothing to do with Northern Ireland, of course, but I stumbled across a quote by Willy Brandt, the former German chancellor and Nobel Prize winner, I think, as well. And Willy Brandt, at the time when the Berlin Wall came down, said, "Now we have all the problems we have always wished we had." And then he paused and said, "And that is very scary and very unfortunate." I'm sure that sounds much better in German. But I think nowadays we do have all the problems we always wanted, and the ones that are in many ways incredibly scary, but also, if I may add, on behalf of my profession, also incredibly interesting. And it will certainly keep the likes of me and Feargal and Bahar and other people, indeed you too, Quentin, busy for decades to come. And what happens after decades, we probably won't be here. And whether this problem will go away, I don't know. So we're living in interesting times where all the questions we used to debate academically are now also being debated in the real world of politics. I was about to say, bliss is it in this dawn to be alive. And thank you for a most entertaining and enlightening and erudite contribution, Feargal. It's been, yes, it's been just very good, and I've enjoyed it immensely.
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks for everybody for taking part. Some great questions, and I think the answer is more research is needed. So.
Indeed.
Thank you so much, Feargal. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.